One of Olsen's predecessors at Citroën was Flaminio Bertoni, an Italian in Paris. He was the stylist from 1932 up until his death in 1964. He was trained as a sculptor and painter and had done time as a sheet metal worker. His portfolio of cars is a formidable testament to his sculptural mind. He thought of cars as industrial art, objects to admire. By 1945, Bertoni had produced his final drawings for the TPV. True to Boulanger's original philosophy, everything was kept to a minimum. At the time, French law only demanded a single headlight. Bertoni immediately gave a styling advantage to this Cyclops. His early sketches suggest a lightweight, single-skin bonnet using simple corrugation for strength. But Bertoni was no primitive. He could express a vehicle's function through its lines and was just as brilliant achieving tension. But what is a line with tension? Carl Olsen.
It's a very difficult question to answer verbally, so I'd like to do a simple illustration for you, which I hope will make it simpler to understand the difference between a curve with tension or something lacking tension. For example, if we start with, this is meant to be a true radius. That is a curve without tension. It's constant over its whole length, and it gives the idea of tranquility, if you like. A curve with tension is an accentuated curve which has a direction. To give you an example, a curve like that, where the radius starts very tight and gradually opens up and becomes flatter and flatter. This has a dynamic quality, which is the character one normally wants to put into a motor car. The 2CV is a car lacking tension, and that is one of its virtues. And therefore, the more soft curves that one finds in the profile of the car and the apertures for the door, these all represent that non-aggressivity, if you like, and represent a philosophy of life, of the vast majority of the deux chevaux owners.
Perhaps the car wasn't really designed at all, just bent from sheet metal, cobbled together.
Certainly the deux chevaux has been designed, and the design itself is largely the result of an intellectual appreciation of what was required to arrive at the lightest weight by using the minimal of materials. You see an enormous amount of form with longitudinal strengthening lines. This, of course, has reduced the weight of the bonnet by roughly 40% in comparison with a normal bonnet.
Deep in the heart of England lives Dr. Alex Moulton. Today, he's better known for his small-wheeled bicycles than for the suspension system he developed for the Austin Mini. Bicycles remain his real passion, but as a suspension designer in the creative 1950s, Moulton remembers the Deux Chevaux only too well.
We first came across it in 1955, and it was a funny little car. It had the very low-powered engine. It was a van, and the performance was so negligible that one of my friends said he could understand the French reading all the works of Voltaire when proceeding from one end of France to the other, because it was so comfortable. You just put the book on the steering wheel. You went so slowly and so stably and so comfortably that you had all the time in the world to read.
But the suspension system of the Deux Chevaux is quite unlike the more conventional systems as drawn here by Moulton. But what does suspension do?
It isolates, by that it reduces the transmission of shock, and that is done by springs And springs, in turn, allow a frequency or a cyclical movement of the sprung mass in relation to the unsprung mass. And so one requires a damper in order to attenuate that movement. So essentially, a suspension comprises spring and damper.
Suspension is very much a compromise between comfort and road holding. But all suspension systems allow a car to move in 3 directions.
There is the pitch mode, which is in that way, and there is the bounce mode, which is up and down in that way, and the roll mode, which is influenced by the bounce spring in that way.
After the complicated torsion bar suspension of early prototypes, Citroën's solution appears deceptively simple. Each road wheel is mounted on a swinging arm, trailing arms at the rear and leading arms at the front. Of course, the front wheels also steer and transmit power onto the road. Remember, the arms and wheels are referred to as unsprung. The rest, including the engine and body, are sprung. Each arm pivots through large tapered roller bearings fitted to a tubular crossmember. These 2 crossmembers are bolted directly onto the platform chassis. On each side of the car, the front or leading arm is connected by a rod to a spring. The rear trailing arm is also connected by another rod to a second spring. Both springs are housed inside this cylindrical chamber. As the front wheel hits a bump, so the leading arm pivots and the connecting rod compresses the front spring inside the cylinder. The spring pushes the cylindrical chamber forward against rubber cushions. This in turn compresses or tightens the rear spring, pulling the rear connecting rod with it. This means that the rear wheel is prepared or tightened, ready for the bump to come. When the bump hits the rear wheel, the reverse happens, as the springs compress in the opposite direction. The cylinder is pulled back, and so the front wheel is pulled down. So the tendency of the car to pitch backwards and forwards is reduced. With simultaneous bumps at both front and rear wheels, the springs compress against the cylinder at the same time. The cylinder is unable to move. The overall springing becomes harder, and in theory should reduce the deux chevaux's tendency to bounce up and down. But this ingenious interconnected suspension system has always had one major drawback: cost.
I would think that it's a simplistic solution, but not particularly simple. By that I mean the components are, I would suggest, expensive to make. Large taper roller bearings, that complex inertia damper, and the arms themselves that don't look to me to be cheap. I would think that it is rather complicated and rather expensive.
Underneath the light-ribbed bonnet of today's deux chevaux lurks the barely changed low-powered flat-twin engine. Along with Walter Beck here, Lucien Girard was headhunted from the mighty Talbot Company to engineer a power unit for the new car. Nearly 8 million of his little engines have been made to date. The 2 earlier prototypes were both powered by liquid-cooled flat-twin engines. Boulanger demanded simplicity. No water-filled radiators to freeze up in the winter.